And get started. So I'm excited that everybody was able to come to this speech, and I just wanted to kind of give a short intro of Robert Jensen before we have him speak. So Robert Jensen is a professor in the School of Journalism at the University of Texas at Austin, and board member of the Third Coast Activist Resource Center in Austin. He's the author of Arguing for Our Lives, a user's guide to constructive dialogue, All My Bones Shake, Seeking a Progressive Path to the Prophetic Voice, Getting Off Pornography and the End of Masculinity, The Heart of Whiteness, Confronting Race, Racism, and White Privilege, Citizens of the Empire, The Struggle to Claim Our Humanity, and Writing Dissent, Taking Radical Ideas from the Margins to the Mainstream. Jensen is also a co-producer of the documentary film Abe Osharoff, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, okay. One Foot in the Grave, The Other Still Dancing, which chronicles the life and philosophy of the longtime radical activist. And so he'll talk to us today. The name of his talk is Social Justice in End Times. And I just wanted to kind of make a personal note how I was introduced to Jensen. And I kind of wanted to give some credit to Michael Lasky, who's a professor in College of Communications, because he is the person that introduced me to Jensen's work, which when I read, especially a chapter from the Citizens of the Empire book, I was just basically kind of struck, and it really sparked a moment where it started, like it made sense to me, and I just liked how it was articulated. So I'm really happy and excited that he can be here with us today. So no further notice.
Everyone, it's really great to be here. When you speak a lot, you say that a lot, and you almost never mean it. But I actually do mean it. I had a chance to go out to dinner tonight with a lot of the folks here, students and faculty. And I've been here all morning, and it's just really refreshing to be around people who are serious about ideas, but also nice people. Those of you who've been around academic life a while know that doesn't always necessarily go hand in hand. So it's been a really great 24 hours. Looking forward to the rest of the day. I'm going to say a few things about books first of all, because I'll forget otherwise. So over on the table are all those books that Cristina just mentioned, and here's the deal. I use the money that I make from royalties and doing these kinds of things to help fund political organizing back in Austin. And that's where this goes. So those books are mine and I pay for them, but here's the deal on the book sales afterwards. If you can afford to pay cover price for them, do so, knowing the money will go to a good cause. If you're a little short, throw down whatever you like. The sort of default price will be $10 a book. And especially if you're a grad student and you're broke because you're working at near serf wages in an oppressive institution, that would be Pennsylvania State University, then you get one for free. My goal is to make sure I have none of those in my suitcase when I leave. So feel free to pick them up. That was very nice of Cristina to talk about my work and everything, but I'm going to tell you this is especially for the graduate students who are thinking about academic careers. I'm going to give you the secret to my success. And by success, I don't want to over-advertise. I mean, I have not yet won my Nobel Prize or my Pulitzer Prize or any prize for that matter. I've never won a prize in my life. But I am a tenured full professor at a major research university, and I get paid more than an adequate wage for doing work that's incredibly pleasant, for the most part. And to me, that's incredibly successful. It's more than I ever imagined growing up. And the secret to my success is very simple. I'm mediocre, and I know it. And that's really important. And it's not false modesty that leads me to say that, because I am good at some things. I think I'm reasonably good at writing for a general audience, and I think I'm reasonably good at taking complex ideas and making them understandable to an undergraduate class. I think I do that fairly well. But in university life, the currency is the big idea, yes? Everybody wants to be known for the big idea. There's only one problem. There aren't that many big ideas out there, and most of us aren't smart enough to come up with them. So what happens, in my experience, is a lot of people like me who are kind of mediocre, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I mean, mediocre is okay. If you know what you're good at, you know what you're not good at, and you can emphasize what you are good at, it's okay. But because this big idea is out there as the sort of currency, everybody's always trying to come up with the big idea, and I think often squandering abilities in the pursuit of something that may not be out there for all of us. I've never, as far as I can tell, I've never had an original thought in my life. And I don't mean that as a joke. I'm kind of serious. What I've found I'm pretty good at is identifying really smart people who do have big ideas and trying to figure out, okay, sometimes people with big ideas aren't so good at articulating them for ordinary people. And big ideas often have holes in them because that's the nature of big ideas. And so picking up on the work of others, filling in the blanks that they have left, articulating that to ordinary people in the community, to undergraduates, that is, I think, a life well lived. And I'm saying that because I know there's pressures on younger scholars to always be posturing in a certain way. And at least my own life, it may be a little idiosyncratic in certain ways, and it certainly is, but it's some evidence that you can take another course. So that's it. That's also a way of, in case you didn't catch on, lowering your expectations for the talk. That's the real underlying goal there, is to lower the bar a bit here. So let's start with this title I gave this talk, Social Justice in End Times, which may seem a little strange because it's rare that people who focus on social justice are into eschatology, this study of the end of the world. Various theories that have been over the years about what is in some context called the end times. So I just want to make it clear that if anybody was worried, I'm not going to launch into some elaborate explanation of how the world is going to end on some specific date. There's going to be no analysis of holy texts that will reveal the truth about all these things. No talk about the rapture or tribulations. No talk of rivers of blood and lakes of fire coming down. And you know, I'm from Texas. You might have thought, oh my God, you're going to get some lunatic who's going to start talking about damnation. Saved. Who is saved here? Who among you can come up in front? Pledge! No, okay, so none of that. I mean, I don't know what your own theological backgrounds are. But I'm guessing that this isn't a big end-time crowd in that sense. So I want to talk not about that, but about what I do think is coming to an end, which are the existing systems for how we organize human societies and the dominant way that we understand our relationship to this larger living world of which we're part. And I want to make the argument that people who are seriously concerned about social justice have to care about this. I'm going to try and make a case, and I'm going to read from a text, which I don't like to do, but I want to try and keep on track. Try and make a case that there is no intellectually coherent or morally defensible way to think about social justice apart from ecological sustainability. And that to think seriously about this is not easy, that it's not going to get any easier anytime soon, which is why it's important for us to face this. So I guess in short order, what I want to try and do today is talk about reality realistically. Not the way we wish the world was, but the way the world in fact is. So let's start with this question of social justice. So we're here at a conference dedicated to that, so we don't have to make the case for the importance of asking certain kinds of questions about that category of social justice. We don't have to argue about whether or not it's important to ask why it's been so difficult for the United States, for instance, to transcend the white supremacist ideas of its history, even decades after the formal apartheid system has been ended. We don't have to ask why it's important to ask about the endurance of patriarchal values, even though feminists have made compelling arguments against them. Why do we keep celebrating capitalism when it produces a world that violates all of our basic moral principles, no matter what our tradition, and undermines meaningful democracy? That's a question that's going to be asked here without any hesitation. Why do we continue to describe the United States as a democratic system when most ordinary people feel completely disconnected from politics, except perhaps as targets of propaganda? Now, we ask those questions because we are reality-based, yes? We don't want to deny the evidence that racialized disparities in wealth and well-being continue. We don't want to deny the routinized violence against women that's part of the lives of everyone in this room and so often glorified in mass media. We don't want to deny the obscene levels of economic inequality, which are growing. We don't want to deny the realities of an elite-dominated political system that marginalizes most of us. So we would reject the attempts of all the apologists for these systems who try to ignore that evidence, obfuscate that evidence. They try to direct people's attention away from the underlying systems out of which those problems emerge, and then the institutions that manage those systems. We say, no, we want to keep an eye on all of that. We want to critique the ideologies, the organizations that make these kinds of problems inevitable. And it's only when we've done that that we can start to talk in meaningful ways about solutions. When you've looked beyond just the evidence of the problem to the underlying systems and institutions. Well, I would argue we face equally compelling questions about ecological sustainability. Why, for instance, in the face of these multiple cascading ecological crises, do we still, as a society, seem to believe that we can continue to draw down the ecological capital of the planet at rates dramatically beyond replacement levels? Why do we continue to ramp up a system that destroys ecosystems? Why do we pretend that we can maintain into the indefinite future a large-scale human presence at contemporary levels of consumptions? In other words, I'm trying to ask, what are the consequences of treating the planet as if it is nothing but a mine from which we extract or a dump into which we pour waste? Those are, it seems to me, evidence-based questions. And there is a way to look at that evidence. My summary is that if you take that seriously and look at the evidence, here's the conclusion that you will inevitably reach. Life as we know it is over. That is, the high energy, high technology lifestyles of affluent societies are a dead end. This is a kind of game over moment. I think there is this growing awareness that we have disrupted planetary forces in ways we cannot control and in fact do not fully understand. Nobody can predict specific times and places when dramatic breakdowns will occur, but I think we can be reasonably sure that the living systems on which our own lives depend is in fact breaking down. And I want to make it clear, I'm not talking about some science fiction future. I'm talking about us here today, all over the world. So that's the way the world looks to me based on the evidence. The time frame, again, I want to point out, is not set. I'm not going to give you the date on which all this is going to come crumbling down. The critic James Howard Kunstler, who talks about this period being the long emergency, this awareness that we are in a state of emergency, but it is a long emergency. When people ask him, well, when is all this going to happen? He says, there's no way to know, but he says, we've entered the zone. Bill McKibben, who may be familiar to some of you, one of the most well-known writers about climate change, in his last book put it this way: the world hasn't ended, but the world as we know it has, even if we don't quite know it yet. Now, maybe this all seems histrionic or excessively alarmist, but I would suggest you look at any crucial measure of the health of the ecosphere, the data that tells us how well this larger living world is doing. And I don't care which measure you pick. You can look at groundwater depletion, topsoil loss, chemical contamination, just the increased toxicity in our own bodies, the number and growing size of dead zones in the oceans, accelerating rates of species extinction, reductions in biodiversity, and just ask a simple question: where are we heading? And you can pick whatever metaphor. Are we going off the rails, over the cliff? You know, everybody's got their favorite metaphor for this. Mine is borrowed from a phrase from the Vietnam War era: the light at the end of the tunnel is the train. All right, that concludes the upbeat portion of it tonight. So here, now let's move into the difficult stuff. Because it's not just the breakdown of this ecosphere. Remember, we also live in a world that is oil-based, and we are rapidly depleting the cheapest and most easily accessible sources of oil, which means that we are going to face in the near future, already are facing, the need to reconfigure the infrastructure that makes our lives possible. Now, instead of coming to terms with that, there's this kind of desperation that has led us into the era of what some people call extreme energy. That is, ever more dangerous and destructive technologies to extract the hydrocarbons that remain. This is fracking, as you've heard about it, deep water drilling in the Gulf and other places, mountaintop coal removal, and probably the most grotesque of them all, the tar sands extraction up in Canada. Well, we can talk more about those, but all of those are ways of extracting hydrocarbons out of the ground and out of the water that are more dangerous and destructive than anyone could have imagined. And on top of all that, there is, of course, the undeniable realities of global warming, climate change, climate disruption, call it what you want. In other words, we are creating a planet on which at some point we are all going to be alien. That is going to be our status. Now, if you don't believe this summary, scientists increasingly are sounding these kind of warnings. Last year there was an important paper in one of the leading journals, Nature, by 22 leading scientists led by a paleoecologist from UC Berkeley. I decided when I read that what I want to be when I grow up is a paleoecologist. I just like the sound of that. Nice job, Ted. They warn that humans are forcing a planetary scale critical transition, quote, with the potential to transform Earth rapidly and irreversibly into a state unknown in human experience, which means that the biological resources we take for granted at present may be subject to rapid and unpredictable transformations within a few human generations. What that means in lay terms is that we're in big trouble. Here was their conclusion with a fairly simple set of recommendations, quoting from that paper. Averting a planetary scale critical transition demands global cooperation to stem current global scale anthropogenic forcings. That means the way we're screwing up the world. This will require reducing the world population growth and per capita resource use, rapidly increasing the proportion of the world's energy budget that is supplied by sources other than fossil fuels, while also becoming more efficient in using fossil fuels when they provide the only option, increasing the efficiency of existing means of food production and distribution instead of converting new areas or relying on wild species to feed people, and enhancing efforts to manage as reservoirs of biodiversity and ecosystem services, both in the terrestrial and marine realms, the parts of the Earth's surface that are not already dominated by humans. That is a tall order. Even in progressive societies, more progressive than the US, parts of Western Europe and around the world, I think most everybody is in denial about what the scope of that project means to transforming everyday life. And of course, in the United States, there is widespread denial of this situation at all, to the point where in mainstream politics, almost everything I've said so far could not be imagined as part of a discussion. Bill McKibben, going back to McKibben, some of you may know he was the first popular writer to bring the issue of climate change to the public in his 1989 book, The End of Nature. His most recent book is called Earth, E-A-A-R-T-H. And he explains the title. He says that we've so dramatically changed the planet that we have to essentially at this point rename it. It's no longer Earth, it's Earth. He explains the planet on which our civilization evolved no longer exists. Again, he's pointing to the present, not to the future. He's not saying this is off somewhere in the next century if we don't get our act together. The planet on which our civilization evolved no longer exists. The stability that produced that civilization has vanished. Epic changes have begun. We may, with commitment and luck, yet be able to maintain a planet that will sustain some kind of civilization. But it won't be the same planet, and hence it won't be the same civilization. The Earth that we knew, the only Earth that we ever knew, is gone. And if McKibben is accurate, and I think, as I've already said, all the data suggests that he's on point here, what that means is it is not enough to imagine that tinkering with existing systems to fix a few discrete environmental problems is appropriate. We have now to talk about massive changes in the way we live. This is what's necessary for what McKibben is calling a new kind of civilization. And it's likely that no matter where anyone sits in various kinds of social and economic hierarchies, there eventually is no escape from the dislocations that this will mean. Money and power certainly will insulate the most privileged from the most wrenching consequences for the time being, but there is no permanent escape from this reality. In other words, we do not live in stable societies. We do not live on a stable planet. However safe and secure we feel in any particular moment, there is no safety and security in the collective sense. Now, you may have noticed that not everyone in the United States is eager to have this conversation. This is not the kind of thing that you talk about at dinner parties, which I always footnote. That's hypothetical. I haven't been invited to a dinner party in many years. I haven't been invited to anyone's home in many years. I don't know if there's a correlation between any of this, but it could just be an obnoxious asshole too. But my experience is nobody wants to engage on this stuff. So why are we so hesitant to embrace this reality and start to deal with it? We're not hesitant to embrace the realities of inequality within the human family. Why are we so scared to deal with this question about the relationship of the human family to this larger living world? I've been pushing on this for the last several years now, and I often get agreement on the assessment of the data. People say, yeah, I pretty much agree with what you're saying. But the reasons people refuse to engage have been falling into some categories that I want to talk about. There are three that I hear most often. The first, and I would argue the most morally repulsive of those responses, is the dodge I hear from some people that, well, you know, species come and go. Well, the way this response usually goes is, yes, we're on our way down, but in the big picture, that's not really surprising. You know, the history of the planet is the histories of species dominating, then going extinct for various reasons. The dinosaurs, blah, 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 you've heard it all. So this position is, well, you know, we've had our time and now our time is passing and the Earth will go on without us. And that's all true, but it's completely irrelevant if you're concerned with social justice, if you have a conscience, if you're a moral agent. That is an insufficient response for a very simple reason, because between today and the end of the human species, which is apparently something to talk about glibly, there's going to be a tremendous amount of human suffering. And that is to some degree under our control. Remember, this is a phrase from the environmental justice movement. They always say that with these problems, the poor and oppressed of the planet get hit first and worst, hardest and longest. The costs of these problems are not distributed equally around the world, which means as the degradation of ecosystems deepens, so will the suffering of people. There's an excellent book out about how this is playing out already by Christian Parenti, the journalist at The Nation. And he went to some of the most vulnerable places in the world and looked at what's happening as a result of climate change. The book is called The Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence. And it's a picture of what the future everywhere is eventually going to look like. Now, for those of us in more privileged positions, we can ignore all this, but I would suggest that to ignore that is to abandon your own humanity. It's really the position of a sociopath. The second dodge, and this is the one that I think is the most intellectually empty, is the claim that we're going to invent our way out of these problems. You know, this response is, well, yeah, there are big problems out there, but you know, human creativity will provide, as it always has. Necessity is the mother of invention. You know, the science that tells us how bad things are will save us in the end. And this is what a lot of us are now referring to as technological fundamentalism. The idea that high energy, high technology can solve all problems, including, very conveniently, the problems created by high energy, high technology. But I think that is about as intellectually substantive as other kinds of fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, national fundamentalism, economic fundamentalism. They all fail on the same grounds. They don't engage reality. So if in fact our fundamental problem is that we have borrow a religious term, fallen out of right relation with the earth, then techno-fixes, which always come with unintended consequences, are not going to be the answer. The future is in recalibrating our understanding of what it means to be human and our expectations. The future then is about scale, recognizing that the scale of the human presence on the planet has to change. Now, there are lots of people, again, I think, who acknowledge this, recognize the depth of the crisis, don't want to abandon either their humanity or their intellectual skills, and will say to me still, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, but there's no point in talking about this public because, quote, people can't handle it. That's the reason to shut up about this, because people can't handle it. Whenever somebody says to me, people can't handle it, I translate that as saying, I can't handle it. Right? If somebody tells me other people can't accept reality, what they're really saying, I think, is I have yet to come to terms emotionally with this reality. And when essentially what I think when we avoid reality because we believe other people can't face it, it just means that we can't face it. And there's a reason we can't face this. Because it is too much to face. It is too much to bear. No human population has ever had to deal with this. So it is, in fact, too much to bear for all of us. But, you know, in the words of all our greatest philosophers always understand, you know, it is what it is. Whether I can bear it or not doesn't matter. It is what it is. I'm not sure. I think that was Plato or Aristotle or Socrates or somebody important must have said that. So it is what it is, and whether or not we want to face it, we don't really have a lot of choices, which is why, to borrow a phrase I've been using a lot, it's time to get apocalyptic. My new bumper sticker is get apocalyptic or get out of the way. Now, again, we have to do some definitional work here, lest you think I'm about to lapse into that sermon you're so hoping I won't lapse into. The problem with that term, of course, is that most discussions of Revelation and apocalypse, in this culture at least, always are focused on the book of Revelation, the final book in the Christian New Testament, also known as the Apocalypse of John. It's important to go back and recognize those terms, Revelation and Apocalypse. Revelation is Latin, Apocalypse is Greek. They both mean the same thing, and they don't mean the end of the world. They mean a lifting of the veil. The notion of Revelation and Apocalypse is about a disclosure of something that was previously hidden from people, a kind of coming into clarity about reality. And if you look at the book of Revelation, it's not just a handbook for a death cult, which is the way it's commonly understood. Lots of biblical scholars read it as a metaphoric critique of the Roman Empire and of oppression in general. So there's a lot of discussion about that book. But I want to focus on this notion of speaking apocalyptically, not as preaching the end of the world, but as deepening our understanding of that world, training ourselves to see through illusions, especially the illusions that people in power have created to keep us trapped within these systems. And in the US, which is without question the most propaganda-saturated society in the history of the world, it's especially important for us to be able to see clearly, to see the domination-subordination dynamic that structures those relationships we care about within the human family, around race, around gender, around sexual orientation, around class, and also realize there is a domination-subordination dynamic in the modern world between human beings and the world. That just as those in privileged positions within the human family take it as their right to dominate and subordinate, so do we as a species do that on that grander scale. So again, we're not predicting the rapture. I'm not going to tell you some mountaintop to go up to where you can be lifted up with me. That for $24.95, I have a program I will sell to you which will give you the time and date of the location of the rapture, so you can be assured of it's part of my television ministry. We'll talk about that later. So in a way, I want to talk about responsible apocalypticism, which is my favorite phrase. Right? So it doesn't mean there's some set script that was written by the divine hand. It's not about predictions. It's about trying to hold on to our humanity when we are frightened of this reality. A kind of honest apocalyptic thinking that's grounded in our ability to read the data and analyze And I think that kind of apocalyptic thinking is not only a sensible approach, I think it's a moral obligation. So if all of this is reasonably sane, then some of the implications are fairly clear. That there are no solutions to the problems that we face if we insist on maintaining the existing high-energy, high-technology existence that is lived in much of the world, including here, and is, as a footnote, desired by many people who currently do not have access to it. Now, a whole lot of very tough-minded folk who are not hesitant to critique other oppressive systems still hold on to this belief in the high-energy, high-technology system. My favorite quote on this, slightly modified, it's not clear who originally said this. I first read it in a piece by Frederick Jameson, and he attributed it to someone once said. I love that. Someone once said, heck, who knows who said it. But he wrote, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. It's a famous phrase. But I think we should modify it to say that for some, it even may be easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of air conditioning. It's not just the economic system that currently structures this domination-subordination dynamic, it's the dynamic itself. So I am arguing in the sense that we do live in a kind of end times. Again, not the end of the world. It is very true that the planet will go on after we are gone. But the end of the human systems that structure our politics, our economics, and our social life. Revelation does not have to refer to some heavenly rescue fantasy or tough guy survival talk, the so-called doomers. To get apocalyptic, I think, can mean recommitting to core values and then rethinking the assumptions that we take for granted in everyday life. So the first thing I think is to affirm that work for justice and sustainability is valuable even though we have no way to guarantee the success of it. Because a lot of people will say, well, if what you're saying is true, what is the point? Why should I not simply abandon any concern for the collective and indulge to the degree I can in my own pleasures? I think we have to make an argument for that. And the argument I don't think is difficult to make. We should be taking on projects, even projects that we know may fail. In fact, even projects that we know will fail, because that's the way you open up possibilities for the world and for yourself. If you think about it, every one of you in the room, in case you haven't pondered this recently, every one of you is going to die someday. And I doubt any one of you gets up in the morning and says, oh, what's the point? I'm going to die eventually. I might as well not get out of bed. We know the end of each one of our individual lives, yet we engage in all sorts of projects. We don't have to be paralyzed by this knowledge. In other words, we have to make the case for why leading a good life means taking all of this seriously. There's another thing I think we have to do, which is let go of some cliches that are much beloved on the left progressive side of the fence. Two of them that I think are important. One is, the American people will do the right thing if they know the truth. You've heard that, yes? That we just have to inform the public and then everybody will act on the basis of shared moral values. I think it's probably time to give that one up. There is no evidence that awareness of injustice will automatically lead citizens of the United States, or people anywhere for that matter, to work to correct that injustice. And when people believe that injustice is necessary to maintain their material comfort, then in fact lots of people will accept those conditions without complaint. Right? Especially in societies, I think, such as our own, where hierarchy and inequality are normalized day in and day out, where it's just assumed that's the way the world works. There's no reason to think that simply more strident education efforts are going to change any of this. The other cliche I think we need to get rid of is the assertion that because past social movements that faced very difficult odds succeeded, therefore we will succeed. This idea that all the great social movements that we tend to look to for inspiration, the civil rights movement, feminist movement, whatever, were at one point up against great odds. And they succeeded, therefore we will succeed. And I think we have to be realistic about that. as well. So it's true that social movements around race and gender and sexuality were successful at changing certain kinds of oppressive laws and policies, and even to some degree to changing the underlying belief systems, although clearly they still linger. White supremacy and patriarchy and such still is part of our world. But those movements that we most often celebrate, and it tends to be the post-World War II civil rights movement that we look to all the time, we have to remember one thing about them. And that's that they were operating in a culture that was based on an assumption of endless expansion. At the end of World War II, the United States was the wealthiest society in the history of the world with unparalleled power. And if you look at, I was born in 1958. In my entire life, the assumption was, until very recently, there would always be more. More of everything, more for everybody. And I think it's important to recognize that pressuring dominant groups in a society to share the wealth a bit is one project when there is an assumption of endless bounty, but it's another project in a period of permanent contraction. And that is what we are in. We are in a phase of the human experience that I think is going to be defined by permanent contraction. There is going to be less of everything. It doesn't mean there is nothing that can be done to expand the scope of justice and enhance sustainability, but I don't think we can be glib about the inevitability of it based on these selective case studies. All right, so where does all this leave us? Well, we can assume that mainstream politicians will continue to act to protect existing systems of power. We can assume that corporate executives will continue to maximize profit without concern for what they call externalities, the destruction of the planet. And I think we can assume that for the time being, the majority of people will do their best to avoid most of these kinds of questions. So I think it is the job for people with critical sensibilities, which I think would define the people in this room, people who are here because we are willing to critique, who are willing to speak out on a consistent basis for social justice. Even when it's difficult to do that it's our job not to back away from these realities just because they have grown more ominous in recent years. So, what does this mean in our work, or our lives, and what we do? I think adopting an apocalyptic framework doesn't mean separating from mainstream society or giving up on existing projects that seek to achieve a more just world within the existing systems. I, for one, think that's a perfectly rational conclusion to reach, even with the analysis I'm offering. I, for instance, I'm a professor at the University of Texas, which, in case you were not aware, does not in general share my values or my analysis of the world. Yet I continue to show up for work every day and teach and engage. One of the projects I'm involved in the community is called Cooperation Texas. It's a worker cooperative incubator. We provide training and support for people who want to start worker-owned, worker-managed businesses, worker cooperatives. They will work in those businesses within an existing capitalist system that I believe is a dead end without question, but I still engage in that activity. I also, I'm just thinking, I belong to a Protestant congregation that is struggling to try and radicalize Christianity, yet we remain within a very mainstream denomination that is cautious, usually pretty cowardly on all things. So every day I get up and go out into endeavors that work within the world that it is. The question isn't, should I give those up? The question is, how do I approach that work? Because I'm apocalyptic, but I'm not prone toward sort of great revolutionary statements. I don't see this as a revolutionary moment in U.S. history. I don't think we're on the cusp of the great people's uprising. Right? If I did, then if I thought that was actually a rational evaluation of the world, then I would choose a different course. But I don't think that is. No matter how many, and there aren't very many, from my point of view, thank God, not very many remaining left sectarians who believe that every day is the day before the revolution starts. I think what we have to do is work patiently on what at first glance, might look like very reformist kind of projects. But to me, the choice isn't between reform or revolution, because I don't think revolution is a rational analysis at the moment. But how can we work on those what may look like reformist projects with a truly radical analysis, so that instead of being happy with whatever reform we can achieve, the reforms that are achieved then just set the stage for the next level of pushing further. So I think we can remain engaged in education and community organizing activities that have relatively modest, immediate goals. And in doing that, we're not just furthering those goals, we're also creating networks and institutions. We're connecting people in ways that I think are going to be very necessary when conditions do change and different kinds of perhaps more radical action are needed. In other words, to sort of use the language of the old left, this is a cadre building time, not a revolutionary moment. And it's not when you take to the streets because the czar is about to fall. Right? It's a period in which you build capacity, you build strength. And that it's in those spaces that we can articulate and I think try to live these values that have long animated these kinds of movements, values mostly of solidarity and equity, that are going to always be essential, and even more essential in times of permanent contraction. To sum all this up, I'm going to steal a line from my late friend Abe Osheroff that I use in a lot of different contexts because it's always very useful. The reason to take all of this seriously, even if you're in a position of relative privilege and can avoid these questions if you want to, is in the end not going to hinge on the likelihood of success or not. It's about how we define ourselves through being in the world. And Abe Osheroff, this longtime radical activist, he was known as, in part because he was one of the last living veterans of the Spanish Civil War. He was one of those people in the 1930s who had actually left his own country, the United States, to go fight in someone else's revolution. It's a very rare thing in human history. And Abe came back and spent the rest of his life in various kinds of radical organizing and community work. And at the end of his life, Abe was able to say, as he often did, he lived in Seattle at the end of his life, and he did a lot of speaking to high school kids. And he said his opening line was always to say that he was richer than Bill Gates, which for a high school audience would think they're sit up. And he said, of course, not richer in money, but richer in other kinds of values in life. And Abe talked a lot about authenticity and living an authentic life. And he threw the term around all the time. And finally one day I said, Abe, what do you mean by authenticity? After all, we live in a kind of advertising saturated world where, you know, you can have an ad that says this podium is made of authentic veneer. Right. What does authenticity mean in the modern world, where it's basically a sales pitch? And Abe, in this lovely, gravelly Brooklyn accent, which he never lost till the day he died, peppered with far more obscenity than I'm going to use. Sensibilities of this crowd are different, perhaps. But Abe would say, oh, authenticity, that's easy to define. He said, authenticity is when what you think, what you say, and what you do in the world are cut from the same cloth. He said people are often afraid to think. They're afraid to even to formulate a thought out of a fear of what might happen. Sometimes he said when people formulate thoughts, they're afraid to speak them, afraid of what others will say about them. And he said sometimes when people think and speak, they're then afraid to act because of the consequences, potential consequences of acting. And he said when we aren't afraid to think, aren't afraid to speak, and aren't afraid to act, he said that is an experience that once you have done it, you will never forget. He said that is an authentic human experience. Right? And he said once you've had that experience, you will never be seduced by the cheap pleasures of the culture. Because he said that's what it means to be human. And in those moments, you know you are a fully human being. And I think it's important to talk about that in a culture where, to be appropriately hip, such talk is, considered, naive. Right? That to be appropriately cynical in the contemporary culture, you would never dare talk about what it means to try to live out what you've said and to say what you think. And so the more times we can do that in public, I think, is to the best. But I don't want to be glib myself. That is not an easy solution to the problem of asking how are we going to confront truths that are too difficult to bear. But I still think that because, I'm just going to digress a bit, when I first started wanting to speak about this kind of thing in public, the first time I did it, I thought everybody was going to hate me more than they usually hate me or whatever. I don't know. I just imagined that I would start talking like this and people would give you that look when they think you're insane, you know? And the first time I started talking about these things, I very gently went into this and I saw everybody nodding in the audience. And, oh yeah. Which tells me that a whole lot of people, not a majority of the population probably, but a whole lot of people are thinking about this and feeling this internally, often in isolation. And one of the reasons to talk about it is because so many people are trying to sort out all of this, but often doing it by themselves. What I want to end with is to suggest that the thing that people say most often in response to this is that if you adopt this apocalyptic rhetoric and this worldview, you're giving up hope. But I think it's just the opposite. I don't think it's an abandonment of hope. I think it's a way to affirm life. And I'm going to now do the oldest trick in the book for speakers, especially speakers who look like me, which is to quote James Baldwin. I highly recommend anyone who ever speaks end with a James Baldwin quote. It's a guaranteed winning ending. For those who are young enough not to have ever been exposed to James Baldwin, he's, for my money, one of the greatest writers of the second half of the 20th century, and unfortunately rather obscure now. He died in 1989, I want to say, somewhere around there. And a lot of his work has fallen off the canon, unfortunately. And especially for me, his essays in the 1960s about the realities of race in the United States, which were my introduction to a sort of way of thinking about that. And in an essay that was previously unpublished up until a few years ago, Baldwin was talking about the obligations of writers and artists. But I think what he had to say in that essay generalizes to all of us. And he said, what we have to remember is that, quote, life is the only touchstone, and that life is dangerous, and that without the joyful acceptance of this danger, there can never be any safety for anyone, ever, anywhere. And I think that is, in fact, true. That if we try to avoid these stark realities because they are so painful, all we are doing is, in fact, undermining the potential of our work for justice and sustainability. So, to end up with another Baldwin quote from that essay, which was published originally in 1962, I think it's important to remember, as he said, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And that is where we'll end the formal part of my remarks and invite for the next half hour. Not only questions, I'm happy to answer questions, but I think this is one of those spaces for challenges, comments, and also reflections on your own experience. There's a lot of people with a lot of great experience from a lot of places. So the floor is open for some conversation. Yes?
I noticed that you mentioned the U.S. is the wealthiest nation now and in history. I wonder if you're counting by the percentage of U.S. this gross national GDP or GNP comparing to that of the globe, or now, or like in the contemporary currency back in history in other countries comparing to the income in the time when they were in their heydays?
Yeah, both. So when we say the U.S. is the wealthiest society in history, we mean both that in a kind of per capita sense, we have hugely disproportionate share of the world's wealth today. And also historically, the wealth of this country, and in fact the modern industrial world, dwarfs wealth in previous eras. I mean, you have to realize that ordinary people in the United States today live at a material level that was known only to the royalty of previous eras. Right? That's a product of one thing. It's not a product of creativity or capitalism. It's a product of oil. It's a product of energy. That, you know, from the late 18th century, first the discovery of coal, then oil and natural gas, what we're living in is a very strange epoch in human history, and I think going to be very brief. And it's the era of hydrocarbons. What makes all of this possible, this incredible wealth, even down to the level of ordinary people, is simply an excess of cheap energy. Somebody did a calculation once, I can't remember, but they said for us to live at the level we live, ordinary, take, you know, middle class America, without oil, we would each need 200 slaves. Right? That to produce the material abundance of this society without the concentrated energy of coal, oil, and natural gas would take a massive amount of human energy. So we're living in this very strange little blip of time where human beings figured out how to tap into ancient sunlight. And so in addition to the energy of contemporary sunlight, we have, you know, millions of years of sunlight we're drawing. And we're drawing it down very quickly, and it's going to be gone soon. And in the meantime, we now know that burning it is going to destroy possibilities in other ways. That's what I mean by wealth. And it's totally illusory.
Yeah, and I also noticed that you are basing your argument like to call for people to take actions based on some kind of moral requirement based on humanity almost, and also basing on the statistic numbers of the damage that is really practical, economic in other parts of the world. So do you see there's the tension between what you should do based on the sympathy and not really having the damage to yourself?
Yeah.
But that's the thing that drives the sympathy.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the problem that we've always faced when trying to undermine hierarchical systems. The motive, except it's a kind of a special problem, the motive force of movements to undermine hierarchy have always come from people on the bottom of the hierarchy. So the classic case of the American Civil Rights Movement was motivated or was moved by non-white people in the United States. But some percentage of the white population was peeled off in support of it, and that's all important. Right now we're talking about still those inequalities within the human family, but a more profound, in a sense, question of the fact that we are rendering the ecosphere uninhabitable for any human, large-scale human existence. So there is a direct, you could say, depending on how you define these things, a direct material reason for every one of us to engage in this. Yet the problem is the consequences of it are not equally distributed around the world, and some of the consequences of it have to be imagined in the future. And human beings are, what we are really good at, every one of us in this room, is denying reality when we believe, for emotional reasons, it's in our own self-interest to deny reality. But all of this is true, and the only thing I'm suggesting is if we don't talk about it, there is a guarantee that this human experiment will crash and burn in the ugliest ways that we can imagine. And in fact, they have been imagined, mostly in science fiction. That's what science fiction is good for. Right? If you doubt this, the book I would recommend that I think does the best job of it is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. It is an amazing piece of work. Octavia Butler, I'm going to digress, is often called a science fiction writer, but she was far more than that. She died recently. And Parable of the Sower is part of a two-set. The second one is called Parable of the Talents. But Parable of the Sower is one of these dystopic novels. It looks at the future, but it does it in an amazingly realistic fashion. It's a book that once you've read it, it's hard not to think in the terms that it presents for what the future is going to look like. And again, not the future centuries away, but a future that those of us sitting in this room can easily imagine being part of. And she's wrestling with all of these questions in that book. And again, as a somewhat of a footnote, I decided to teach that book in a first-year seminar class that we have at UT. And I assumed that young people would hate it. You know, young people don't want a downer. I did it as an experiment, thinking it would be a one-year experiment. And in fact, the students loved that book. Again, because it gave voice to something that's sort of churning underneath, that in fact we are in trouble, and if we don't deal with it, here's what the world might look like. And that is, I think, where we're headed. There's a hand back here. Yes, I'm back.
I had 3 questions. I don't know if you want them all at one time.
Sure.
Or should I do them one at a time?
Let's see how we do.
Okay. My first question was, and you kind of, I guess, just touched on it, because you see a lot in, I guess, popular culture with kind of this theme of apocalypse. You see The Walking Dead. It's very popular. It's a movie. 2 movies that are coming out. After Earth is one. And I think Oblivion, I think with Tom Cruise, is another one that's talking of this. Do you think that is something that helps? Is that more helpful to you in terms of the point you're trying to get across? Or do you think that that kind of puts people in a mindset of like, that's a fantasy and that's not really going to happen?
They're all these zombie and I don't even know the genres. Lots of these movies about this. There are 2 things I would say. One is the fact that they are vampire movies. There's all these sort of genres that I don't pay much attention to, probably should. But I think along with the religiously based talk about rapture and end times, I think it's an indication that, in fact, lots of people are thinking about this. It's just not risen to the level of kind of specific, concrete analysis. So I think it's an indication of what's on people's minds. Is it good or bad? I think it depends on whether the experience of taking in that pop culture leads you to think more deeply about these underlying realities. And I don't know enough about either the films themselves or how audiences interpret them to know the answer to that question. But they certainly provide an opening, and anybody who goes to see them or is part of a social group in which those movies are part of the discussion, it can be a platform from which to, whatever the movie itself does, it can be a platform from which one tries to engage people.
My second question is, and I just think you did a good job. My second question is, because you mentioned rapture. I was going to ask this last, I'll ask this now. You know, and I was having this conversation yesterday, that if you're somebody, whatever, I guess, religious ideology, if you're somebody that just believes in right and like there's a God who's just and right, doesn't this world as it's currently constructed then have to end because of how evil it is?
Yeah, let's do the other question too, and then I'll go on.
You mentioned, and you touched on you feeling that it's a need for reform. Even though you mentioned how, you know, the reform in the past haven't really totally taken down the system of, like you mentioned, white supremacy and patriarchy, and that you said you felt like this isn't the time necessary for like industry revolution. This is the time for capacity building. What do you see makes you think that? And then what would be the sign to you that, like, what would then happen to make you feel like this, all right, this time, it's go time, you know, it's in the street, you know, everybody like, you know, let's topple this thing.
Well, let me take that last question first. Some of you may have, in February of 2003, been part of the demonstrations to try and prevent a U.S. invasion of Iraq. On February 15, 2003, estimates vary, but somewhere between 10 and 20 million people worldwide took to the streets in the largest day of coordinated political activity in the history of the world. It was unprecedented. There's never been anything like it. Right? In Austin, you know, I always say I was part of a lot of demonstrations around U.S. foreign policy in Austin from the 90s into the early 2000s. And it was the same protest every time with the same 29 people. We all knew each other. We would assemble, you know. And so that day was really striking because there were something like 10,000 people in Austin, and nobody expected it. The sound system we had didn't even reach to the second half of the crowd. It was just amazing. Right? 10 to 20 million people worldwide. It was phenomenal. What effect did that have on the U.S. decision to invade Iraq? The answer is probably zero. And it was not going to have any effect. That what had once been an effective street strategy in previous eras was no longer working for all sorts of complex reasons. That, it struck me, after that, it was time to give up on organizing traditional kinds of street protests on those issues. Because every time you pour money, energy, and time into one organizing strategy, you're taking it away from others. When one doesn't work, it's not just, you know, well, it's okay, it didn't work, but we tried. No, it means that when you're trying that, you're not trying other things. So all of this is an imperfect, you know, evaluation, trying to figure out when, where, what, why. But it strikes me that all of the evidence of the last decade is pointing toward the fact that this is not that kind of moment. But I don't know that you can ever really predict. So I was born in 1958. In 1958, the possibility of progressive social change in the United States was close to zero. Right? It was the end of the second big Red Scare of the 20th century. Women were still pretty marginalized from any public life. It was still an apartheid society. If somebody had stood up in the moment of my birth and said, you know, the world is about to change dramatically, you would laugh and say, not today. Yet within a decade, in 1968, every major system in the world was being challenged in certain ways. Would anybody have been able to predict that in 1958? I doubt it. Any more than we can sit here and predict when the conditions will change that make one kind of activity suddenly viable when it wasn't the day before. I don't know. But I do think that because certain tactics have worked in the past, there's a desire to keep replicating them even when they are failed. And I think, you know, it's time to recognize some of those are failures in the moment. I always say everything I do fails for the most part. Right? I mean, I'm always involved in causes that we're not winning in the short term. So my standard line, to put a happy face on this, is I don't mind failing, I just want to fail in new ways. I don't want to fail in this, I want to try something. And often when you're failing in terms of a campaign to achieve a policy or something, you are building capacity, you are establishing networks and all that sort of thing. I can talk more about what we're doing in Austin, which is actually kind of upbeat and exciting. The rapture talk in religion, remember that there is no such thing as Christianity, which is where most of this comes from. There are simply competing interpretations of what it means to be Christian. And even those people who believe in some sense in the notion of the rapture, which, by the way, the word rapture never appears in the text. It's an idea that came out of the book of Revelation. It's not mentioned in the book of Revelation. Some of it's based on the assumption that we are in an age characterized by good and evil, and the only resolution of it is a complete, you know, destruction of the evil world. But that's not the only way to interpret that text. And lots of theologians over the years have interpreted it in lots of different ways. And to me, to answer a question you didn't ask, the value of staying engaged with certain kinds of traditions, for me, Christianity, which is what I was born into and have gone back to, is not because it has the answers, but because it's a place where you can engage people on these questions. So when people say, well, you know, this whole world is coming to an end, say, what do you mean by the world is coming to an end? You know, when people say God wants this, say, what do you mean by God? There are these points of intersection that I'm hesitant to give up because it's a place where you can push people. Yeah.
So what is to be done in our research, in our teaching, in our service? There are a lot of comm scholars, but I look around and I see there's a lot of other scholars and activists too, and artists. Yeah. So I just wonder if you could, you know, share some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, no one has a definitive answer to the question of what should one do. It depends in part on one's talents and temperament. Some people are good at some things, not good at others. So all of this has to be in the context of what are you individually capable of doing. It also has to be in the context of how will that help you stay sane because to commit to a program of political action that is guaranteed to make you crazy is in nobody's benefit, including your own. Right? So that's, all of that has to be worked out. And then it seems to me that a lot of it's just what is possible where you live. Right? So the only thing I could say, I'll give you one example. In Austin, Texas, as I said, I was part of a lot of anti-war activity and things like that, projects that were failing and doomed to fail. They were also projects that tended to be exclusively, or at least predominantly white. And so I don't know if anybody's ever seen this happen, but there's a group that's overwhelmingly, sometimes exclusively white. It formulates a plan, right? And because the white people in it are all good, liberal, progressive leftists of some sort, at some point in that planning process, they look around and they say, oh, wait, we're all white. We need people of color. And so you go scurrying about to find people of color. And you actually have, I've heard conversations with, does anybody know a black person who would speak at our event? I mean, it's so crass and so ugly and so despicable, right? And everybody who's white has probably been in that situation and heard that. Everybody in the room who's a person of color has probably been asked to do one and it's really, really vile, right? It's the worst kind of organizing. And after being engaged in activities like that 10, 12, 15, 20 times, I finally got the picture that that was probably not a good way of organizing. Right? There was something really wrong with that. And so when the anti-war movement failed, and I couldn't bear the thought of any more of those kinds of organizing meetings, the small group I was part of, which was all white, kind of a core of 3 or 4 people, we said whatever we're going to do locally from now on is going to be cross-racial from the beginning, organically. It's not going to be a project we start and then we invite other people in. We are going to work in some sort of collaborative fashion. And that led to the purchase and renovation of a community center, a building where we have offices, meeting space, event space. And it's led to a whole lot of these possibilities that come from networking and connecting and building an institution, a place now where people in Austin know that if you go there, you will find hospitable folk around issues of justice. We're going into the 4th year of that project. Now, it's not a revolutionary project. In addition to the worker cooperative incubator I talked about, there's an immigrant worker advocacy program there. There's a gardening program in the backyard. It's all this stuff that is not surprising to anybody who's paid attention to what's working in the world these days. And I don't know what the eventual outcome of any of those projects will be, but I know that in the meantime, they are cementing our place in the community in a physical location, not just online somewhere. Right? People are face-to-face and engaged, right? And that good work is being done in the meantime. People are being helped, and we're changing the way people in Austin think. That's what I do, and that was what was available to me there.
Can I interrupt if you don't mind? My collaborator is a central part of the Occupy Oakland.
Can I hold down for a second? Can people over here hear? Yeah. I think we're going to have to really try and project.
My collaborator, who I have written a paper about heteroculture and convenience culture, the addiction of convenience culture, is part of the Occupy Oakland movement, a major part of the Occupy Oakland movement. And in our paper and in her research, Kara Judea Alhadef, she has very specific strategies, which your name's Michelle, isn't it? Which I would be very happy to share with you, and I'll be talking about some of them. So it turns all of this theory into very specific practice. I don't know, can you hear me over there? Karen, you can hear me. Turns it into very specific practice because frankly, I think it's really important for us here in this group to address the reality that we are so addicted to convenience culture that we're not willing to even consider the possibility of bartering, as an example, to very specifically counter capitalism. We're not willing to not use these, pardon the expression, I won't use the word, people aren't using curse words, so I won't use the word fucking plastic bottles of water. That I think it's really appalling that Penn State continues to use plastic bottles of water for conferences when we can use pitchers the way we used to do a few years ago. And also the fact that cell phones are so incredibly toxic, especially for young people, and especially in a group like this where everyone has a cell phone. I'm freaking out just being in this environment, frankly. So there are many specific things that each of us can do that are really proactive and that will in fact change. I frankly, in 1968, I was part of the movement to stop the war in Vietnam. And frankly, I am under the delusion that we actually did stop the war in Vietnam by taking to the streets.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting question. I do not think that's an obvious assessment of, what stopped the war in Vietnam is a question that people still continue to debate, although it's clear, I think, those movements had some role in it.
Well, those of us at the time thought that we were very directly, maybe people who were born, 10 years later don't see it because you weren't there.
No, it's not a question of who was there and who's not. It's a question about what actually brought to a conclusion the Vietnam War. But I think that there's often this, I think, false alternative between changing the system and making changes in your own life. Right? So there's in very simple form, sometimes either you have to radically shift your own life, and that's the way change comes, or people will argue it doesn't matter what you do in your own life because the system has to change. And it seems to me that that is kind of a false alternative, that we do things in our everyday life that reduce our own consumption, that disconnect ourselves from consumer culture in all sorts of ways, in part because it's mentally healthy to do so. I think it usually leads to a more joyful life. But not because we believe that by individual actions like that, the general human relationship to this larger world can change. That requires dramatic changes in the nature of systems. But sometimes the way we get to a point where we recognize the need for dramatic changes in systems is because we have cultivated a different relationship to each other and to the larger world. And so all of these things are, I think, worth doing. And I think it's also good to go easy on ourselves in a certain way. I mean, I flew here on an airplane. I can make no justification for getting on an airplane to come here, except that Cristina made it very attractive, and I like coming to places where people treat me nicely, and all sorts of reasons that I'm here. But I'm not sure I can make a very good case for doing that. That is, we're all implicated in this. Wendell Berry, the writer, who some of you may know, if you don't, I highly recommend his work. He's kind of the poet laureate of the sustainable agriculture movement. And he always tells this story, this joke, about for lack of a better term, the village idiot, whatever it is, the guy in town who appears to be rather slow, who's out on a walk, and he comes upon two guys digging a hole. And he yells down to the two guys digging a hole, "What are you digging a hole for?" And the two guys say, "This is where we're going to bury all the," I won't use a street term, "we're going to bury all the people in town who are causing problems. We're going to bury them here." And the guy who is walking by says, "Yeah, well, who's going to cover them up?" It takes a minute to let it sink. We're all implicated in this at different levels. It doesn't mean we can't make judgments about the level at which someone is implicated. I think it's good to critique Al Gore, for instance, who's critiquing global warming, who lives in a 9 million square foot house and just sold a television network for millions of dollars and will pocket it all, and still preaches capitalism as the solution to ecological. I mean, it's good to be able to make judgments about different ways that we're all implicated. But it's also good to recognize we all are implicated. And each one of us could look at everybody else's life and point out the obvious flaws in the way you live. And that conversation should go on, but go on with some sort of kindness, I think. We're almost out of time, so maybe we'll take the remaining comments, and I won't really answer. So let's just start over here and go across the room.
Yes, I was looking at the recommendations that you have made, and a lot of them seem to be centered around questions of consumption waste or destruction.
Mhm.
And you had one suggestion in there that was to reduce the rate of population growth. And I remember sitting in 7th grade science class and learning about carrying capacity and deciding on never having kids who are already close to capacity. This isn't going to work, and then realizing it was totally ridiculous and I still want kids. What suggestions do you have? Is there anything that can be done given that people it's
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, and I'm going to...
because all the others are implicated in that.
Yeah, and the main thing to avoid is the often openly racist, or at least stupid comments come from the first world that looks at overpopulation as a problem in the third world. In other words, relatively privileged white people telling non-white people they have to stop having kids, when in fact it's kids in cultures like this that are a far more dramatic strain on the ecology. Here's the way not to do it. A friend of mine once announced that he was having a kid, and I said, that's too bad. I said, our kids are the locusts of the planet. That didn't lead to a productive conversation. In a bad mood. I don't have an answer to that, except that it's not just about the raw numbers of people, it's clearly about per capita consumption, and where is per capita consumption the highest? Maybe one solution is to sterilize all Americans over a certain income level. Right? Because all we do is reproduce kids who buy a lot of plastic shit. I don't know. I mean, I have no answer to that. Because human beings we are biological entities as well. So I pass on that one. Go ahead.
Yeah, you would say how you were talking about how people know things that go on and don't say stuff. You know, and it's like, what are we going to do and what are people going to do to talk more openly about, you know, things that go on that need to be talked about. And it's like, you know, what's going to, you know, because you see the media, they only report what they want to report. People only basically talk about what they, you know, want to talk about, and there's many more topics that can be talked about that aren't talked about. So it's like, what are we going to do, and how many more people are going to step up and, you know, make that difference and talk about things that need to be dealt with.
Yes. I think that's a good point. It's sort of implicit in what you're saying is that each one of us, whatever limits to our own ability to work in the world, have a voice. And if nothing else, everybody can go into social networks where you're part of it and raise these questions.
You were speaking about or implicating capitalism heavily in these problems. And I know other places you've mentioned that it's hard for us to see beyond that. Using the feudal state, people in the middle of the feudal state, it's hard for them to see beyond that. And that you've also mentioned that social systems, generally as we know them, have not lived up to their potential. And I would submit maybe movements like green Marxism may have some promise there, especially when we think one of the thrusts of green Marxism is to release human potential away from this profit motive. And I think of the incredible amount of energy engineers use to get around other people's patents. So if we're able to release this human potential, do you think it might be possible then that we can actually band together and figure out technological solutions?
No. I do not think there are technological solutions to most of these problems.
Let me rephrase that.
All right, but I'm also, can I hold on? Because I'm looking at Cristina because we are now at the end point of the session, and I don't want to be part of a problem of stealing time from others.
Right.
So
we have a couple of minutes. The thing is that our next session starts like literally in 3 minutes.
Okay. So I'm just going to, let's leave that as an unanswered question.
Sorry.
About which reasonable people can disagree. And that's my favorite phrase. Reasonable people can disagree. I think what we're talking about here, and maybe just really quickly,
Go ahead.
I don't want anything I said to leave people with the impression that it's hopeless. I mean, I am a tenured professor. I make $91,000 a year. If I wanted to stay drunk for the rest of my life and watch cable TV all day, I could do it for a long time before they'd even know I was gone from work and cut off my pay. I mean, if anybody could coast, it's people like me, you know? And I find all of this not a reason to stop doing things, but as reasons to intensify my own efforts. Not because I'm such a great person, but because that's where meaning comes from in my own life. And to touch on what several people have said, The United States right now is the most wildly productive society in the history of the world. Right? There's never been a society that produces stuff like we do. We have an abundance of everything in this culture except meaning. And that's in the end the motivation, is what does it mean to live a good life? The classic question from philosophy. And it has something to do with meaning. And this culture and its dominant institutions does not produce meaning. And all of the activities that everybody here has been talking about being involved in or planning to be involved in are where meaning is created. And that's why I say none of what I said should be advice to do less, but in fact, advice to do more. So my last word is to remind you that there are books over there that you can either take or pay for. There's also on the end a clipboard. I have a text of this which has footnotes if anybody's interested in it. If you put your email address, I'll send you that text and also put you on an automated list where I send out new articles that I put out now and then. Other than that, my only other comment is to thank not only Cristina, who took the lead on this conference, but all the other, literally too many people to name, really wonderful folks I've met, and the rest of you I hope to meet for the rest of the afternoon. So thanks, it's been really great. Appreciate it.